quick introduction to Ithala. That's South Africa for you. Oh no, hang on a sec. The province of KwaZulu-Natal, and that's the 30,000 hectare game reserve that makes up Ithala, right up in the northwest. What I want to point out before I move on is that these three boundaries on the west, the south and the east are fenced, and that is the Pongola River, which is an unfenced boundary, which is particularly difficult and quite unique in the South African scenario in that most of our protected areas are fenced. How things started there in Ithala, sorry it's black, I'll have to read through it. Back in 1990, 50 elephants were introduced to Ithala, all from old culling operations in the Kruger National Park, and the oldest animal that was introduced there was 12 years old. And there were a number of protected areas, both private and state, at that particular time that introduced elephants in a very similar way from the Kruger National Park. And obviously what happened once we'd introduced these elephants, and them being so young, they started to increase in their productivity fairly quickly, and we started to see quite a substantial increase in the elephant population, which obviously led to a point where we started getting relatively concerned about their density versus what we felt we could actually successfully carry. Okay, in terms of Ithala itself, there are obviously other challenges other than the growth of our elephant population. I've already referred to that unfenced boundary. And what happened is, with that unfenced boundary, after the introduction from about 1993, our elephants started crossing that river and going out into the communal land on the northern side of that river, which is generally speaking uninhabited, certainly closer to the river, but obviously the threat of potential human-wildlife conflict exists because you're having constantly larger number of elephants crossing there and obviously bumping into people along the way. That's an example. It's not a very good photograph, but that's an example of us having to chase, that's about 60 elephant across the Pongola River with a helicopter, which happens on a relatively frequent basis between November and about March every year. So we're in the middle of it at the moment as well. Okay, so back to the translocations of those smaller groups of animals into smaller protected areas, and the consequences nationally in South Africa was that there were a large number of very fragmented elephant populations in smaller protected areas, as I said, both state and private, and we're dealing with this burgeoning elephant density, and Ithala was one of those examples. And at the time, the management actions that were implemented to deal with this increasing elephant population was often very ill-considered and not effectively regulated in any way. So individual landowners or managers or whatever were simply doing what they thought was right. And it elicited a huge amount of criticism of our state conservation agencies, and eventually, as I think Audrey referred to earlier on, there was a round table of a whole bunch of experts, and it resulted in the gazetting of the norms and standards for elephant management in South Africa in 2008. And the norms and standards really were aimed at trying to regulate how managers and landowners dealt with their elephant populations, both in the context of introduction, both in the context of existing populations. And what it also did is it established a hierarchy of the kinds of options that you could implement as a manager. However, the overriding requirement was the need for every population, whether it be private, whether it be communally owned, whether it be a state protected area, to have an elephant management plan that was endorsed by the appropriate permitting agency. And in that elephant management plan, you need to stipulate an implementation strategy that takes cognizance of these options in that hierarchical order. And that gets forwarded for approval, and in the lifespan of that elephant management plan, and decrease the existing population. So the appropriate suite of acceptable management actions, we wanted to apply those to get back to the target density. We understood there was a lag effect in the efficacy of the immunocontraception, with no effect on the already pregnant cows, as you've already heard, and it was co-funded by HSI and ourselves. The approach, Audrey and and JJ discussed it quite extensively. Our population number was a bit of a challenge. You're dealing with a relatively large population, so you can't work with individually known animals, which is much better because you get far better data from that type of situation. So we developed what Henk already referred to as the blanket approach, whereby a percentage of your animals as desired is then darted, and you obviously calculate it so that you still allow a certain number of animals to come through. It's not 100%. You're never going to be 100% effective in going back to every single breeding age cow every year. And because you're implementing this system by default, essentially you're getting an increase of between 1 and 3% as a default anyhow. So it's then administered from a helicopter, as JJ extensively dealt with. And this has been done in 2007 in Tembe, as Henk said, and rolled out at us at Ithala and Ithala Game Reserve, and then Fertility Park since 2014. Now, Fertility Park is currently darting over just around 300 animals a year. So it gives you some idea of the extent to which you can actually implement this method. Okay, the effect in Ithala, now with the use of contraception, the blue line indicates where we think we would have ended up now had we not implemented any kind of management of our elephant population, and currently we're sitting on just over 190 elephants. So you can see there's a defined reduction in the estimate that we would have had versus what we've actually ended up with. I think this is probably the most important slide because it very, very clearly demonstrates from the time that we started. So this is the number of animals and the years that we darted, and those are the number of yearling calves that we counted every time we did the contraception. And what's very clear is this large decline down to 2019 where we just had 6 calves. So there's absolutely no question that it has the desired effect, that the blanket approach can work, that you don't end up in a situation like Audrey referred to where you have no calves coming into your system, and that it at least achieves some sort of balance in terms of your continued social structures. So just in the context of our overall implementation strategy, referring back to the fact that we're still over our desired density, obviously the contraception is slowing the population growth, but it will not reduce the population back to the density that we want. So we have moved some animals to Mozambique in 2018, and we are working on the other options within the norms and standards, including potentially expanding habitat, erecting an electric fence across the Pongola River, it being unfenced, to protect those communal property inhabitants, which will essentially result in default additional habitat to the elephant, and if agreeable, could result in a formally proclaimed increase in the reserve size by about 15,000 hectares. And if we get that right, essentially with the implementation of contraception and the increase in available habitat, we'll get back to a point where our density would be acceptable. So my thanks to our partners, ACT, the University of Pretoria and HSI for this. Thanks very much.